Okay, so this section is called 4.2 Soil Formation and Erosion. So let's talk more about soil and what all you need to know for your AP test. Okay, let me go ahead and put this in presentation mode. Okay. All right. So, what is soil? Soil is basically a mix of geologic and organic components. That's really important that you know that. You also should know the different types of soil, like what are the different particles that make up soil. So, in soil, we have the components of either sand, silt, or clay. And those are the three types of particles that make up all soil. And so we'll actually be looking at soil in our lab coming up here very soon. And we'll be sorting out the different types of particles in the soil so that you can actually see what those look like. Okay, so there's also humus, which is the main organic part of soil. And this is basically just broken down biomass like dead leaves. If you go out in the yard, in your yard or your flower beds, especially, and dig up some soil, you'll see that there's some dead leaves in there. There's dead pieces of tree, like dead branches. You may even find some dead, like bugs, beetles, worms, different things, centipedes, millipedes. And then you'll also find waste. And if you hear my dogs barking in the background, that's probably the UPS truck. So I apologize for that. Hopefully they'll stop soon. I'm going to pause the video. I'll be back in just a second. Oh, I think they stopped now. Okay, good. All right, and then there's also different nutrients that we find in our soil, like ammonium, phosphates, nitrates. We're actually going to do some tests where we test to see how much of those nutrients are actually in our soil. I'm going to pause the video. I'll be back in just a second. Okay, I think the dogs have stopped barking, so let's get back into this. So there's also water and air found in soil. And then lastly, I think we probably all know that there's living organisms. And we're going to show a video in class that kind of really delves into like what all we find in the soil. It's pretty cool. Okay, so other things that soil is important for, or things that are important to soil, the first one is plants. Soil actually helps to anchor the roots of plants. It also provides water, shelter, and nutrients for plants to grow. So that's very important. Without good soil, we wouldn't have any vegetation. All right, and then soil is very important for the water because soil can actually filter out water that runs through it. So if there's any contamination like pollution particles or anything in water, soil can actually filter that out, which is important. And soil can also filter the runoff. So you probably know, and if you don't, you're going to know this when we talk about watersheds, that it rains and water all flows down into creeks, streams, those sorts of things. You guys, I'm sure know this. And so as that water is running to get down, gravity kind of pulls it down to the lowest point, like streams and rivers. Pollution actually gets trapped by that soil as well. And then there's nutrient recycling that happens. So decomposers, when something dies, a plant, an animal dies in nature, there's decomposers that break down the organic matter that make up that living organism and then return those nutrients to the soil. So that's really important. And then lastly, soil provides habitat for different organisms. Earthworms, fungi, bacteria, moles, slugs, lots of different things live in the soil, snakes even. And so we'll talk about that in more detail when we do our soil lab. I've got a nice little video to show you before we do that. Okay, so moving on. Soil can either be soil can form through weathering, where rocks and things are weathered by the sun, by rain, and eventually those particles run off into the soil. So weathering is one way that creates soil, and so it can either be physical. There's three ways that weathering can happen: either through physical weathering, biological weathering, or chemical weathering. Physical is just the wind, the rain, the freezing, the thawing. So it gets really cold and it gets really hot. That actually breaks down rock. Biologically, either from the roots of trees, or we have organisms like mosses and lichens that can actually secrete enzymes that break down rock. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then also chemically, through acid rain. Oh, Actually, I didn't think about this. I was considering moss and lichens to be biological, but technically they secrete those enzymes, which are chemicals. And so actually moss and lichens would be a chemical type of weathering. So don't make that mistake like I did. Okay, and then these rocks basically are broken into smaller pieces. They're carried away, they're deposited by erosion. And erosion is super important because it does transport this weathered rock fragment by either wind or rain. It's carried to this new location, wherever that location is. It basically runs down because of gravity and it gets deposited somewhere, usually in the bottoms of lakes, or it can even, we have the Ohio River, which is connected to the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River runs into the Gulf of Mexico. So we can even have soil here in Indiana along the Ohio River get washed away and end up being deposited in the ocean in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's kind of cool as well. All right, I'm going to turn off my webcam here so we can see this last piece. It says that erosion can negatively impact water quality because soil holds those plants, which filters the water. If all that soil gets eroded away, that means there's not going to be plants there to filter the water. And then ultimately the water quality will suffer. So, erosion's not necessarily the best thing. It's a natural process, but it's not necessarily the best thing for ecosystems. Okay, all right. So soil formation. This is just another little chart on that. Basically, the weathering of that parent material, the rock, produces smaller and smaller fragments. We end up from that rock getting the sand, silt, and clay that we're going to see in the lab when we do the soil lab. And we also get a lot of minerals from that rock. Minerals are stored in the rock. And then from above, this is what happens below the surface. Above the surface, we have a breakdown of organic matter, which, if you've ever walked out through a very natural forest, you'll see a lot of leaf litter, you'll see a lot of sticks that are breaking down, they're decomposing. It kind of looks like mulch, actually. Mulch is actually just humus that we add to our flower beds to make them look pretty, and it also holds moisture in for the plants, which is a good thing. But it's this breakdown of organic matter that is adds nutrients to the soil. And then erosion also deposits soil particles from other areas, and so that helps add to soil as well. So the effects on soil formation, we have that parent material. It actually creates pH levels within the soil and adds nutrients. Topography affects soil. If there's a steep slope, we have too much erosion. If there's more level ground, we have more deposition of that erosion. Climate affects erosion or soil formation. If it's warmer, there's a faster breakdown. So in the summer, there's a faster breakdown of organic matter. If there's more rain, like we've had this summer in 2024, there's more weathering, there's more erosion, and there's more deposition. Okay, so warmth and more precipitation causes all of these things. And then there's different organisms that can impact soil formation. So things like bacteria, fungi, worms, they all break down organic matter. And if you don't have those organisms in an area, maybe there's been some sort of a disturbance that has killed off those organisms in an area, that can actually be bad for the soil formation. May not end up with plant growth in that area. So anyway, those are things that we look for, and those things have impacts on soil formation. Okay, another thing you need to know are soil horizons. Do you need to memorize every single one of these? And I'm going to stop my webcam for a minute so we can see these. We don't have to memorize them. I think it's a good thing to know, that there are layers of soil. You should know that there's this organic layer at the top, followed by some topsoil. There's an alluviation layer that kind of holds minerals and organic matter. It actually can leach through this area and go into the subsoil. And then that's where we have a lot of deposited minerals and metal salts. And then down below is this parent rock, which is partially weathered rock. If you've ever heard the term bedrock, that's the unweathered parent rock that is at the very bottom of our soil layer. And so that's really important because over time that'll start to just break down more and more and more until we end up with soil. Okay. Do you need to memorize each of what's in each of these different layers? No, I don't think that's super important. I do think you need to understand that there are layers. At the bottom is the bedrock, at the top is the humus, the organic layer. and then there's these things in between. So I think that's what's super important for this. So my students usually stress about memorizing each of these layers, and I don't think it's super important for you to know the names of each of those layers. Okay, so, some things you should know. We're going to talk about this a lot more when we get to Unit 5 with agriculture, and we're even going to do a compaction lab, a soil compaction lab. So, I don't think this is something that is super important for Unit 4, but it will be for Unit 5. But we can have a loss of topsoil from farming, and this can create farming conditions that are not good for growing plants, which is really bad for farmers. That's what they want to do, is grow plants. And so it can also be easily eroded if there's a lot of tilling that we don't, when the farmers work the land, they need to do that in a sustainable way, and that's what we'll talk about in Unit 5. Because if we have erosion, that means the soil's gone or it dries out, it removes the nutrients, and the soil organisms can't recycle nutrients, and it basically just becomes like, a field of death essentially, and then nothing will grow there. So that's not a good thing. Compaction is another issue, and farmers have to be really careful driving over land with tractors or bulldozers or just cars in general, vehicles. They also have to worry about grazing livestock, which can compact the land. And then humans walking over land. All of this can actually reduce the ability of the soil to hold moisture, and that's the lab that we're going to talk about later. The dry soil erodes more quickly. I think of the Dust Bowl that we had, years and years ago. Um, and then where there was, agriculture couldn't happen across the plains, the central part of the United States. And dry soil supports less plant growth, less root structure, leads to more erosion, all of these things, nutrient depletion, all of this stuff. So this is soil degradation. And like I said, we will talk about that later. Okay, let's move on because I'm talking too much in these notes. So this is your 4.2 practice FRQ. Come up with an investigation. What would be a scientific investigation to measure the effect that climate has on soil formation? What could you do? Then it's really important that you identify the independent variable and dependent variable in your experiment. I will provide an answer for you. Realize that your answer is going to be different. If you have any trouble identifying the dependent and independent variable, make sure that you talk to me either in class during some free time, or you could stop by during Pathways. It's really important that you understand this. One of your FRQs on the AP test is going to make you identify controls, independent variables, dependent variables, all of that sort of stuff. So make sure you're talking to me in class. Okay, next time that I see you, we're going to be working on 4.3, soil composition and properties. See you guys next time.